A woman named Jo is out with her daughter hiding from everyone. Jo is very scared and tells her daughter Alice that she doesn't know how, but since returning from space, everything around her has changed. It's as if she doesn't recognize this world, her family, or anyone else. Everything seems unfamiliar to her. Jo thinks she will soon discover what's happening to her. Saying this, she starts looking at a device in her car, which she had stolen before fleeing. They then arrive at an old house where she burns a fire and get her daughter to sleep. She starts examining the device in the car, then she suddenly hears her daughter screaming from inside the house. When she goes in, she finds her daughter sleeping peacefully. Jo comes out again and, surprisingly, hears her daughter's voice coming from another direction. What is happening? Let's go back to 5 weeks ago. 5 weeks ago, Jo was on duty with her fellow astronauts at the International Space Station. Jo was talking to her daughter Alice and her husband Magnus on a video call from Earth. At the same time, a big experiment was taking place at the station, conducted by Mission Commander Paul. Their head on Earth, Henry, was giving them instructions and emphasizing how important this experiment was. Scientists had created a new cell device to experiment with dark matter and uncover its secrets. When Paul started the cell device for the experiment, there was a big explosion at the station. An unknown object collides with the station, causing immediate communication loss with NASA on Earth. The entire station was heavily damaged. While one escape shuttle remained intact, the other was inoperative. Commander Paul was severely injured during the incident. Henry sent a message to the crew, instructing them to keep the cell device safe and secure because it was crucial to solving the mystery of dark matter. Meanwhile, Jo was outside the station trying to repair the ship to prevent it from being pulled into Earth's gravity and crashing, which would mean certain death for them. It seemed like something unknown had crashed into their ship. Suddenly, Jo saw a female astronaut's body floating in space. Jo tried to catch her, wondering who she was, but couldn't reach her. She informed her fellow crew members in the station about the body in the orange suit. It was strange because all the members who had come to the station were accounted for, and their spacesuits were white. So, who was the dead astronaut in the orange suit? Communication was re-established, and Jo informed the base about the situation. A big problem arose. Commander Paul had died due to his injuries, and the space station was severely damaged. Oxygen was leaking from the collision, making it clear that the station wouldn't last much longer. The base instructed the remaining crew members to return to Earth quickly. However, there was another problem. There were 4 astronauts, but only one working pod, which could only carry 3 people. The other pod was damaged. Jo, being the senior officer, decided that the rest of the crew should take the working pod and return to Earth. She would stay behind to try and repair the damaged pod. Before the others left, Jo made a drawing of the body in the orange suit and sent it down to Earth for further investigation. Government Secretary Irene insisted that they had to leave the cell device in the space station. She believed that no meteorite had collided with the station, and the damage and Commander Paul's death were due to the experiment they were conducting with the cell device. Meanwhile, 3 crew members safely landed on Earth using the escape shuttle. Jo, who stayed behind, began repairing the damaged pod and realized she had only 5 hours of oxygen left. She needed to fix the shuttle quickly before all the oxygen leaked into space. Before communication broke again, Henry instructed Jo to bring the device with her in the escape pod. As Jo was working on this, she suddenly found herself in a gallery with a closet door that had her daughter's necklace hanging on it. Then, the story jumps to 5 weeks in the future present time. On Earth, Jo was following the sound of Alice's voice in a deserted place. She sees a cabin and approaches it. Inside, she found the same closet with her daughter's necklace hanging on the door, just like what she had seen 5 weeks ago on the space station. Jo quickly opens the door and, to her surprise, found her daughter Alice inside. Alice asked Jo where her mother was. Everything was very confusing because Jo had left Alice in another cabin. So where did this second Alice come from? The situation was getting more and more weird. Jo quickly returned to the first cabin to save her daughter from the cold and began bathing her in hot water. To her surprise, she saw Alice sleeping on the bed where she had initially put her to sleep. So who was the second Alice she found in the closet? Jo ran back to the bathroom, but no one was there. The story then goes back to 5 weeks ago, where Jo was busy repairing the escape shuttle. She had very little time left and needed to ensure that Paul's dead body and the device landed safely on Earth. Henry and Irene were on Earth, preparing for the shuttle's landing. As Paul's body was placed in the escape pod, strange noises came from the station. Jo went outside to investigate and saw Paul's severed hand. When she touched it, she saw Paul alive again. but the vision quickly vanished, leaving her alone. She felt that Paul's death and the stress of repairing the shuttle were causing these hallucinations. Henry, using all his resources, was determined to bring the device back to Earth, because the results of the experiment were still stored in it. In space, Jo managed to repair her escape shuttle at the last moment, and also brought the device with her. She recorded a final message for her family. As Jo started launching the shuttle from the space station, there were only a few seconds left, and the oxygen was running out. However, Jo discovered that her shuttle wouldn't launch due to an error. To launch it manually, someone had to go outside the station to the control room, which Jo couldn't do. This seemed to mean certain death for her. Then, unexpectedly, a shadow appeared in the control room and manually launched Jo's shuttle. Jo was extremely happy and surprised, but didn't know how this miracle happened. Her shuttle launched on its own, allowing her to escape and land safely on Earth. When Jo's shuttle landed, NASA's security team carefully helped her out. Her daughter and husband were already waiting for her, and they hugged each other, relieved because they thought Jo might have died in space. Henry was also happy because Jo had safely brought dark matter experimental device down from the space station. But who was in the control room of the space station and manually launched Joey's shuttle? Jo is happy to be back on Earth, reunited with her family. Henry, meanwhile, starts examining the results of the experiment conducted in space. The story then shifts to 4 weeks later to present time. Jo, in a state of shock, asks her daughter Alice what happened when she was supposed to bathe her. Little Alice says she fell asleep as soon as she came in and how much her mother has changed since returning from the space station, and she is acting weird. Hearing this, Jo runs to get the device and decides she needs to find the other Alice. She starts heading out to the cabin where she found another Alice. At a press conference while discussing the death of Paul on the space station, Jo talks about Paul's wife. Surprisingly, Jo is told that the name she mentioned about Paul's wife is completely wrong. Jo is sure that Paul told her this name himself, so how could it be wrong? Henry is still trying to decipher the data from the device, which is quite strange. NASA begins investigating the explosion at the space station. When Jo tells people she saw a dead female astronaut in a modern suit, no one believes her. They point out that no footage shows this dead astronaut, and there is no record in the past 50 years of any astronaut disappearing or being killed in space with their body not recovered. People think Jo is sick, so they tell her to take some medicine to help her memory. Jo then goes home, but she notices her husband is acting very strangely, as if their relationship isn't going well. According to Jo, their relationship is fine. She also finds her daughter, Alice, behaving very oddly. Alice's actions and behavior seem very strange to Jo. The next day, Jo is told to change her statement and say that the shooting was due to an internal error and there was no dead astronaut. However, Jo refuses to lie. After the meeting, her boss, Frederick, starts touching her inappropriately as if they are having an affair. Jo firmly rejects him and asks why she would cheat on her husband. This incident helps her realize that why her husband Magnus has not been communicating with her properly, but she still does not understand that she has never had an affair with her boss. She goes to her husband and asks him to make love to her, and they become intimate. Meanwhile, Henry discovers from a device that they are not in their original universe but in a multiverse where there are different versions of themselves. Henry is thrilled to have proof of the multiverse theory. Henry goes to meet Jo and finds Alice outside. He starts explaining the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment to her, illustrating how scientists have never fully understood physics. He mentions Albert Einstein's theory about how the same substance can exist in two different places simultaneously, which relates to parallel universes. Henry uses Alice's toy as an example, showing that while the toy is white in their universe, it could be black in another parallel universe, existing in both colors until observed, which is known as the observer's effect. The next day, while Jo is with her crew members, she discovers something surprising. The dead female astronaut she saw in space was actually Irene, who is now the head of NASA. The photo was taken in 1960 when Irene was an astronaut, but she is still alive today. Jo wonders how she saw Irene dead, especially in her youthful form as an astronaut. Feeling confused, Jo decides to visit Commander Paul's grave with her companions. To her shock, she sees Paul alive, which scares her and makes her question her sanity. She again starts thinking she might be delusional. Jo goes to the commission and tells them about seeing the dead body of young Irene in space, using it as proof that she might be hallucinating. Jo hopes to relax and live well with her family. However, when she returns to her old house with them, she notices differences. For example, she now has a blue car, but she remembers having a red one. Over the next few days, Jo discovers that her husband had been thinking of divorcing her because he suspected an affair with her boss, Frederick. However, after Jo returned from space, her husband changed his mind and decided not to divorce. Jo also finds a piano in her room, although she never had any interest in playing the piano. Moreover, her daughter Alice, who could understand the Swedish language, now behaves as if she never learned it. Jo is baffled by these changes and doesn't know why they are happening. Meanwhile, Henry has a clue. He discusses his findings from the device with a colleague, explaining that he believes his experiment in Paul's space accidentally opened a portal to a parallel universe. This might explain all the strange things happening to Jo. Neither Jo nor Henry initially realize that this isn't Jo's original universe. Jo's boss, Frederick, visits her again and asks why she has changed so much since returning from the space mission. He mentions they were supposed to go on a trip together. Jo tells him she doesn't know why he's saying this, but insists she is happy with her husband and does not want to meet Frederick. When Jo goes home, she finds a parcel containing 2 tape recordings sent from an observatory in Denmark. One tape is of Jo when she was repairing the escape shuttle at the Space Center. The other tape is from a space mission in 1967 and features a female astronaut. Jo decides to investigate this and tells her husband, Magnus, about it. However, Magnus thinks Jo is mentally ill and that this is why she changed so much after returning from space. He calls NASA for medical help, but Jo doesn't want this. During the argument, Jo pushes Magnus, causing him to fall unconscious. Determined to uncover the truth, Jo decides to leave with her daughter, Alice. On the way to the lab, she takes the device, convinced that it is the cause of all the strange events happening to her. Jo starts to think that this isn't her universe due to the experiment she conducted in space. To uncover the full story, stay tuned for the second part of this amazing series. Subscribe to the channel for second of this series and other exciting content. Thank you.